Okay. Welcome to episode 3 of Among the Thorns. We're going to get into the mental attacks of pornography addiction today. And really just discussing kind of one area of this. I'm going to try to be a little bit more efficient because I do a lot of random chatter, which I'm doing right now. Try not to do that. So let's see how we do. Now, in regards to the topic at hand, I'm going to be saying, probably using the words brain and mind interchangeably for the purpose of this little dialogue. Even though you're not just an organic computer, there is more going on in your mind than just chemicals in your brain. Different topic for a different time, though. But understanding a bit better how your brain works can help to equip you. I found it encouraging in my own personal fight. Hopefully it will help you as well. So I want to briefly discuss first the decision centers of the brain. I'm going to call this the thinking brain, or the decision portion of the brain. That would be the prefrontal cortex, right? So that is the area of the brain that, analyzes things, that lets you think about it, trying to decide, hey, should I do this? So you've got kind of, we're going to call this the feeling brain, probably for the sake of this. It's the part of the brain that feels things. It wants things. It's hungry. I want food. Sends a request to the thinking portion of the brain. Hey, I want food. I need it now. The thinking portion of the brain then gets to say, okay, yes or no. Yes, go eat food. Or no, it's dangerous because the fridge has a explosive strapped to it. I don't know. But basically, your thinking portion of the brain will determine, should I do this or not? This is very, very key when it comes to addictions. When it comes to pornography addiction, this aspect of the brain is hugely at play. You can kind of think of this as path through the woods, right? And by that I mean, you have wiring in your brain. You have pathways in your brain that connects different activities, different things. Some of that wiring, right, comes from the feeling portion of the brain to the thinking portion of the brain. That wiring, that pathway says, hey, I need this thing, from the feeling section. Goes to the thinking section where it can say yes or no. If you imagine that as a pathway through the woods, right? A well-trodden pathway in the brain that goes from point A to point B. So what will happen is, in addictions, if you have repeated an activity countless times, the pathways in the brain, kind of for the sake of efficiency, it no longer goes to the decision-making portion of the brain. It no longer asks your thinking brain, hey, should I do this thing? It just says, okay, wait a second. We've done this 10,000 times before. We know the outcome. We know what's going to happen. We're going to save ourselves a little bit of time, and we're just going to do it. So when it comes to an addiction, right, that pathway in the brain, it completely skips the decision portion. And it just says, hey, we've done this a lot of times. We know what's going to happen next. Let's just do it. Scary. I find that both terrifying, also a little encouraging, because if you've struggled with this addiction for a long time, I can almost guarantee that you have had those moments where you find yourself scrolling the internet, looking through random sites, perusing through pornography, and there's something in the back of your mind that's screaming at you, what are you doing? Stop. I don't want to do this. Stop. Well, that's the thinking portion of the brain that has been relegated to the back. Instead of it being at the forefront, the prefrontal cortex, where it should be, the feeling portion is just taken over and said, nah, we're going to do this because we've done it so many times. You don't almost get a say in the matter anymore. It's like the choice has been taken away from you. I say that's encouraging only because understanding that is what's going on can help you to realize that monster inside of you. It's like, what is going on? There have probably been times, I know there were times with me where I was like, what am I possessed? Why am I doing something I don't want to do? Paul spoke about this in Romans, which, by the way, for the topic that we're going through, the entire book of Romans is heavily applicable. Highly recommend it. Romans chapter 7, though, you hear Paul speaking about it, and he says, I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know that what I am doing is wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So I am not the one doing wrong. When he speaks about law there, he's talking about the Ten Commandments, right? For instance, where it says, thou shalt not commit adultery. I will do a topic on why pornography is a sin, why, it is a sin for a Christian. But one of the things is like Jesus said, if you have done it in your head, or done it in your heart, then you've already done it. It's pretty much the same thing. So by looking at pornography, you are committing adultery. So that's why he says here, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So he's agreeing, okay, yes, this is sin. So I am not the one doing wrong, he says. It is sin living in me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I want to do what is wrong, or I don't. Well, yeah, part of you wants to do what is wrong. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. Which, by the way, doesn't mean that you're not still on the hook for your own choices, but it's very much applicable to what we're talking about. The decision-making portion of the brain being skipped, right? He said, I have discovered this principle of life, that when I want to do what is right, I inevitably do what is wrong. I love God's law with all my heart, but there is another power within me that is at war with my mind. This power makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. Oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? And thank God, the answer is in Jesus Christ our Lord. So you see how it is. In my mind, I really want to obey God's law, but because of my sinful nature, I am a slave to sin. So, Paul is talking about this exact same thing that we're talking about in a little bit different language, right? It's interesting, terrifying, but also helpful to understand what's going on behind the scenes. Paul also wrote in Romans 6, he said, don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living. Pretty cool, actually, that Paul was talking about this 2,000 years ago, and we are now discovering through modern technology and new medicines these principles in our brain at play 2,000 years later. That's kind of neat, actually. But so I want to discuss a tactic as far as that goes. I will say first and foremost that our victory is definitely found in Jesus Christ, but we still have to fight this fight. Before I brought all of this to the altar, before I went up and I asked God, forgive me, for what I've done, I really didn't have a say in it. I remember I was completely a slave to sin. I didn't even have a choice in the matter to one little iota. If my body wanted something, I gave in to it. I did terrible things, right? As a young teenager, all to satisfy those urges. But once I had went and I had been given that new nature, Paul talks about it later as he has nailed his flesh to the cross. He has died in Christ, and there's a lot there that's worth contemplating about, worth thinking about. but we can have freedom through Christ. Um, Unfortunately, the nature of pornography addiction is such that unless God reaches into your brain and really just instantly transforms your mind, there is that verse, be transformed to the renewing of your mind. And we should pray that, I think, in regards to this. We should ask God's help with this. He is there with us. He is there to help us and to assist us through this, to strengthen us. So pray that. Um, but unless God gives us a miracle, which I hear people, they're like, I did this, I fasted, or I prayed, or I became a Christian and God removed this from me. But unfortunately, for the overwhelming majority of people, God expects us to fight through this. I believe. Well, one tactic is simply the rewiring of these pathways, right? Think about it this way. If we're talking about a pathway through the forest, we are going to lay a new pathway. We're going to do that by doing the right thing. So every time that we, instead of giving in to pornography, we resist, we push back, we say, no, we're going to do something else. Which, by the way, a really powerful, very powerful tactic in regards to winning, in regards to doing the right thing, laying a new pathway, is the tactic of distraction. I'm going to speak about that a little bit more in the next episode. I'm almost out of time here. Distraction is more powerful than resistance. So that's actually true in warfare as well. That's true in martial arts. If you can distract your enemy, instead of having to overpower him, if you can get his eyes off of what you're doing, have him looking over here while you attack over here, that will help you a lot, right? In regards to pornography addiction, that means that when you feel that urge come on to you, when you feel that urge enter your brain and you're like, okay, ooh, I'm tempted. Instead of resisting and thinking and fixating on that temptation, distract yourself. Go do something else. Go take a walk, take a jog, watch a movie that won't have any kind of tempting in that regard. Go watch a history movie or something. I don't know. But distract yourself. Get your brain onto something else. That is one of the ways of laying a new pathway in your brain. And so that tactic of rewiring those pathways, which will help, unfortunately, it's a long road. It's not going to happen overnight, this particular tactic. But it will absolutely work. It will 100% help. Now, it will feel pointless at times because you'll feel like, okay, I've succeeded. I didn't look at porn for 3 days. And then you cave and you look. Or I didn't look at porn for 3 months. And then suddenly you cave and you look. The good news is that by not doing it, by choosing to do the right thing, every time you do it, you make that pathway a little bit better, a little bit more concrete, a little bit easier to see. And by going longer and longer without using that old pathway through the woods, that one becomes covered up with debris and dirt and with leaves. And so, unfortunately, the bad news is that those brain pathways are always going to be there. Within reason, they're going to be there for a long time. But the good news is that all the good new pathways you're laying, they're going to be there too. So even if you fall, you have not lost all that progress. It's still there. It's there for you to build on in future victory. And so even though the bad pathway, it's still there too. So if you happen to trigger it somehow, you dig down through the dirt, you hit that pathway, suddenly your brain is going through this same addiction like it was in the past. And it feels like, wow, I haven't looked at porn in 3 years. Suddenly I looked and now it's like I never stopped. What is going on? That's why. Knowledge is power, and understanding how your brain works in these regards, I think, is tremendously powerful. So we're going to talk about, I think, probably some of the chemicals that your brain releases during the activities of pornography addiction and so on in the next episode. But for today, thank you. I hope this was informative, helpful. If you just happen to stumble onto this, subscribe. The quality will get better in the future. It's terrible right now. I know. Bear with me. But I will be putting out more of these, so stick around, and I hope to see you in the next episode of Among the Thorns. Dun dun dun.